Well, I'm honored to welcome today's guest, Turner Simkins, author of Possibilities, a deeply moving mentor about his family's journey through his son's Brennan's battle with leukemia. Turner's also the co-founder of the Press On Fund, which has raised millions to support groundbreaking pediatric cancer research. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you in person, virtually, I should say.
Yeah.
And really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely, man. Well, it's my pleasure to be a conduit for this story. I just finished the book, and to anybody listening, please look it up on Amazon. It's called Possibilities, and it's a wonderful read. In the book, you describe the moment that Brennan was diagnosed as a point of no return, where life as you knew it ended. Could you just kind of walk us through that day to start us off?
Yeah, I probably need to walk you back to a couple of days before first, if that's all right, just because it gives that day a little more context. Brennan had three boys. They're but 3.5 years apart. We had a little scrum. My youngest son and Brennan, who's the one who was diagnosed. I have Christopher, Brennan, and Nat, and then descending order, youngest to oldest. And Brennan was they were all very active, but Brennan was extremely active of all the three of them. He showed this almost this prodigious abilities with anything sports related. His hand-eye coordination was kind of freaky good. At like 5 years old, he was in junior golf tournaments competing against 9 and 10-year-olds and beating them. And whether it was, you pick something up, throw it, whatever. And
Right.
That fall of 2000 and this was the fall of 2008. He was 6 years old. He didn't want to go to soccer. He just kind of was getting lethargic and complained about his leg hurting. And we took him to get some x-rays, and the doctor said, it's, nothing. And he goes, but, you may want to, if it persists, you may want to get some blood work done. We didn't really, think much about it then. But then in January of 2009, we went to the mountains, North Carolina mountains. We were in Augusta, Georgia. We were about 3 hours from the North Carolina mountains, where we get a lot more snow and so forth. And when we got there, he did not want to play in the snow. And that was weird, because we woke up in the morning, there was 3 feet of snow on the ground. All the other kids were making snowmen and throwables, and he stayed in bed. And we just all right, something's up. So we took him into the doctor on that Monday. My wife did, excuse me. I was working, not in just basically in the same office space. And we didn't get any word. She took him in the morning. We didn't get any word. And finally, 5 o'clock, the doctor called and said, we need to bring him down to the hospital as soon as we can. And the 5th floor, where the Medical College of Georgia is located here, the Children's Hospital of Georgia is located here. And they've got a great pediatric cancer team and facilities. And I walked up into the building with my wife and Brennan, and the elevator door opened. There was a kid standing there with an IV pole and no hair, and just lots of bags of stuff on it. And it was just this instantaneous, oh God, here it is. It was like when the elevator's doors opened, it was like we entered into a new life, and we just kind of knew that feeling. It's just an inherent sense of things, when whether it's after someone who's experienced a hurricane, where they wake up and they've got no more home to live in, or
Right.
lose a loved one. It was that sort of feeling. It's hard to articulate, really.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, especially a feeling that you never would have expected to have to feel. And I'm sure in that moment, maybe it was hard to find hope. But you have written, hope is not a strategy, but without hope, there is no strategy.
Right.
And as you had, gone on with Brennan's diagnosis and continued through treatments, how is it that you went from kind of that shock to finding little slivers of hope to keep you guys going through those difficult times?
Well, I think it was really one day at a time. If to the listeners, it's a kid who had leukemia. It's really more than that, because as I'm sure it might get to at some point. He relapsed multiple times. And had we seen far enough down the road, had we known, that this was potentially where we would be, and there was, 3 years had we been able to have some sort of portal into that was even a possibility, I think hope would have been a difficult thing to hold on to. It was, we had our heads in the proverbial sand for a bit at the beginning. Modern medicine had may gone miles and miles down the road in terms of finding a cure for pediatric leukemia. But we also, at that time, I didn't know that there were several types of pediatric leukemia, and that the most common one, ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, has a very good cure rate, some in the upper 90%. It's a grueling treatment process, but Brennan had AML, acute myeloid leukemia, which is rare in children, and it has had, even today, it's one of the poorer survival rates. So, I guess it was just sort of one step at a time, Otherwise, if you're thinking about it, it's just like trying to play a football game. You talk about hope or strategy, right? I mean, your strategy can't be to map out the fourth and long play for a Hail Mary with the times out. I mean, obviously in your brain can conceive of that, but if you think you're going to have your back against the wall at the end of the game, it's going to be hard to play the first three quarters.
I appreciate you raising the fact that he did relapse a couple times, and I want to spend a minute maybe talking about him, because obviously I've never met him, but he sounds like a profound young man. Can you just speak a bit about his attitude during this whole process, and maybe how that helped to guide you all and inspire you to stay strong in this fight?
Children are just better patients, for one thing. There's a naivete, excuse my accent here. But there's just this sense of, kids are kids. And so, he just, by nature, being young, was a good patient. Now, we didn't tell him. He was diagnosed on his 7th birthday, right?
Yeah.
We weren't going to tell him, this is a potentially lethal disease that you could die from. That's the last thing you want to tell a little kid. So we just told him it's going to be a while. It's going to be hard. We told his brothers the same thing, And he just went through it. And then you end up in a pediatric cancer center with lots of other little kids. And then, if you ever have a chance to go to a St. Jude's or a Sloan Kettering in New York, where you are, or wherever it may be, they make these hospital wards, fun for the kids. There's playgrounds, there's video games, there's, all sorts of stuff for them to do. So, and they're around other kids who are rolling with it. So I guess it's just a little bit of that. But as we got further down the road, and there were, I guess after his second, we were preparing for a second transplant. Some of the kids we met had died, and you can't hide that from a kid, right?
Right.
So we were inpatient, not impatient, at the Children's Hospital of Georgia for 3 months. Out. Then we were in for a couple of months for bone marrow transplant, relapse. Then we're in the hospital, and we were effectively in the hospital for a few years. And so there's a point where the cat's out of the bag, and that's, I think, where he really showed whatever inner thing that it is that he has. I mean, he's different in that way, and it's just this. Even if you met him today, I mean, he looks different than his brothers because of all the toxic stuff we had to pump into him. He's smaller. I mean, it affected his growth. It's affected part of his pulmonary system, and it's had some mild brain damage that you would never notice, but it does affect his memory. But anyone who meets him just senses this thing. It's an energy thing. Maybe it's just because we kind of got into all this sort of believing in whatever potential strings of hope we could believe in back in the day, whether it was holistic medicine or not. But there's something in him that just breeds, strength.
There's something profound, I think, about this combination between naivete and then just like inner strength and optimism as well, that I think maybe only a kid can possess. And it sounds like he absolutely had that. As far as you and your wife during this journey, you spoke a bit about this, I guess, tension between optimism and realism. I imagine that's a very difficult place to sit at. How did you balance sort of, I guess, never wanting to think about the worst, but also trying to prepare for it and also believing that the best would actually happen? What was navigating that like?
Once you realize that, when you realize that, all right, the chances aren't good. And then, and here's the deal is, when you have a bone marrow transplant there's two, you can get, people hear about bone marrow transplants. There's two different kinds. You can have an autogenous transplant, which a lot of, cancers get, like neuroblastoma, for example, which is a cancer of the central nervous system. Those auto transplants, you use your own stem cells. Basically, they take your own spinal fluid, your own immune system, and you pump it back in your body. And in Brennan's, it's someone else's immune system, right?
Yeah, right.
So, as soon as we were told about, we needed a bone marrow transplant, you had to get in remission, 3 months of chemo, and then after that, transplant. Then you go into the transplant center, and they start mapping it out for you. And you see that 1 out of 10 kids don't make it through transplant, much less, they don't even survive the event of getting the transplant.
Right.
And then there's this thing called graft versus host disease, which is when the new immune system, like if your immune system is suddenly put into my body, you're the bone marrow donor, your immune system goes into my body, it's going to see the cancer as something bad, which is the whole goal, right? To keep that at bay. Because, a cancer cell is a normal human cell. It's not a disease. It's not a virus. It's nothing else. I mean, it's a supercell within our own bodies.
Right.
So it's not something, I think there's a lot of people in the world think think of it as something, analogous to like typhoid or something. It's not at all. So this new immune system is keeping that at bay, but it also sees everything else as bad, right? So that's called the graft versus the host. I would be the host, you would be the graft.
Right.
And so, then that's the second biggest killer of pediatric leukemia patients, then failure, that's it's its own set of risks. And so all of a sudden you're like, oh, geez, you got to be optimistic. You wouldn't do it, right?
Of course.
But there's a point, but he had 4 of them. He had 4 bone marrow transplants. And the first was a perfect match, his brother. The second was a perfect match from the bank. And we're very fortunate as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Catholics, I guess, that there are a lot of donors. Minorities, mixed race people don't have that luxury. And it's this, which is a whole nother thing. If this podcast does anything, it's to get people to go to and register as a donor, particularly if you fall into one of those minority buckets. Anyway, I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but the point is that once you have 4 of them and then you step out on a limb further, because then all of a sudden he's got half matches, like I was a donor. His mom was a donor. Those are half matches, and those could be they could be not only deadly but just brutal. I mean, I've seen kids who've died where the half match is just eating them up. Their skin looks like 3rd-degree burnt. They are effectively 3rd-degree burns where the immune system is eating them up from the inside out, and it's a gruesome death. It is painful and long and brutal. And you're thinking to yourself, well, this is the only thing that can save my son. I mean, you don't want to be Dr. Frankenstein, And matter of fact, we got criticized because I had a blog, I had the scare pages thing, and people were, I had 10,000 readers for this thing. And
no kidding.
It was almost like a reality TV show. It was like people were following it because they get passed around in groups. Obviously, some of those were our friends, but the vast majority of them didn't know who we were. And then you get emails from people saying that, we're playing God, or, that it's our fault if he dies because we're not good Christians and all this kind of garbage. You've got all that stuff playing against you, making you doubt yourself. But, Brennan didn't want to quit. By the time we got to the 4th transplant, we gave him the choice because the doctors were even split on that. They took us in the room, said, listen, he's been on a ventilator. He'd gone through everything, and we've been in the hospital, and our transplant guy said, I've never seen a family go through more than y'all
really
right now.
Really.
And we're split. He goes, I don't think you should do it. I think you should let him go home and pass away peacefully, be with his dog. He says, but the other half thinks we should do it, and I'll do it if y'all want. So we just let Brennan make the decision, and he said he wanted to do it. And later on in an interview, I don't know if you Googled any of the, if you typed in Brennan Simkins Today Show, he was interviewed on the Today Show a couple times because it was such a big deal that, he even said it when he was like teen, I didn't want to die, It's like, well, what do you say to that? You can't deny a kid that at that point in time.
And also, I just want to note, as you know well, what an incredibly weighty decision to make as a kid, because I can imagine that at that time he knew the reality of the situation, right? We either try this or things don't look too good. And so, for lack of a better word, kudos to him for making that decision.
Yeah,
what was likely the hardest
by that
decision.
time, we went to a lot more later, but the kids had already been to 2 funerals of friends.
Yeah.
Brennan had, the brothers had, Brennan hadn't been to one yet because he was too, his immune system was so messed up. So again, it's like cancer. The immune system is effectively what leukemia is, right? He had to wear masks way before masks were an issue. And that's why I was, so bothered by that whole COVID thing. Because, I mean, it's a reality. I mean, the bottom line is, we're all past things, whether it's a cold or whatever. And a common cold could have killed him. Anyway.
Look, you touched on faith, and faith comes up often on the show, and the show isn't really a faith-based podcast, but I have noticed that it is a recurring theme, and I am curious, right? You spoke a bit about grace in the book as being the space between pain and peace. Can you just talk maybe a little bit about how throughout this process, how you found faith amidst this tremendous suffering, or how you found grace? I'd be really curious to know if you had moments like that.
I think so. I mean, grace is a complicated term to, truly define. I think, there's lots of philosophers, T.S. Eliot, and there are lots of people who write about grace, theologians, whatever. So I think there's different definitions of it. But, that all came from that statement came from that was real-time statement. It's a lot of the stuff in the book came from my blog. And yes. I just, I had through 2,000 pages of blog material. And when I started going back through it, to create this thing. So that was a statement, that's not me trying to be, fancy, in writing. I mean, that's just what came out at the time. And it was because that's what I was feeling. But, if you think of peace, as being, this sort of ultimate reality, when there is no more pain, and, grace is, it's kind of really that thing that, it floats in there somewhere, and, where the faith part, I just became a Catholic a few years before, which I think was a God thing now. My wife's Catholic. We raised our kids Catholic, and I wanted to make sure I could at least go to the communion station with them.
Absolutely. That's important.
But anyway, so the old saying about there are no atheists in foxholes, right? I mean, there's a lot of prayer going on from people that wouldn't even normally think about it. To what or whom is a whole nother subject, and I don't think that's relevant necessarily. But it was good for me because even wherever we went, the Catholic churches have mass every day, so. No matter what town, we were in Atlanta, we were in Memphis, we were in Augusta, there was always a church I could go to for, half an hour or whatever. They'd go to a noon mass or a morning mass somewhere, and it may just be me. It may be me and some homeless people, maybe some older people in there, but it was, that part was good too, because, it wasn't just like me at a conventional church where it's everybody from your neighborhood or your club or whatever, you know what I mean? It was like, this is probably more what the pearly gates look like, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So, just being around that, just having time to reflect and think about, that, to give it up to God or whatever it is we're trying to do is a hard thing to do, because, I mean, it is. But there's a point where it's not in my hands; it's in the hands of the doctor, sort of. But there was a lot of stuff that went on here that you could call up the bone marrow transplant team or the leukemia team or whoever at St. Jude's, and there was some stuff here that just happened. That is it the doctors? Is it faith? Is it the the holistic healer guy we brought in there who I think had something who certainly didn't hurt? I tell you what, this might sum it up. When Brennan, we knew we had to do a second transplant. He had relapsed within just like 90 to 120 days of his first transplant.
Yeah.
We went back to Atlanta to find out what the next steps were, and the doctor said, "I'm sorry, here, this is these two nurses here. This is Susie and Becky or whatever their names were. They are grief counselors that we've brought in to help you and your children deal with the fact that that there's nothing you can do. He's going to die." And we were like, well, we drove to Atlanta for this? I mean, he said, well, there's nothing else that can save him except for a transplant. And he just had one, and the standard of care won't allow two transplants that close together. You can't have two transplants within a year of each other.
Yeah.
Or the second one's bound to kill you. And there was just nothing. I mean, it was like we walked out of there just like we'd been hitting the head with a brick. So we started calling everybody. And my friend Stephen Chance, whose son Patrick, is coincidentally good friends, son a little bit younger than Brennan, had neuroblastoma. They were being treated at CHOP in Philly. And he started asking the doctors up there. He met a bone marrow transplant guy, and we brought up, and he said that he'd tried it once. and it didn't work. He said the kid died a really bad, painful death on a ventilator. But once he was on the ventilator, I guess he was okay, but it was not good. But he felt like he'd learned a lot and could maybe, he felt like he learned enough to give it a go. We almost went there. But, we in the meantime, obviously, we ended up at St. Jude's. We found something. It was a kind of a coin toss. And thank God my wife and I agreed on that one.
Yeah.
Because if we hadn't and something had happened to, Lord, there's a big divorce rate of pediatric cancer. I don't know if you know that, but it's like 75%.
I didn't know that.
I mean, you can imagine, like you say that you're with your wife and she wants to go here and you want to go there, but where you go, something happens and your child dies. I mean, there's going to be some, friction.
My fiance and I can't even pick a place to eat. So
right.
I get it.
Think of the little stuff. And then you get into finances. I mean, we both had to quit work, for like years. Because you can't. We had to pick the kids up and move. You just do what you got to do, right? Anyway, I'm telling you all this because when we were at Memphis, he had relapsed. He'd gone through the second transplant, relapsed again. We were in the midst of the third one, and things were going kind of haywire. And we got a call and said we need, it's getting kind of tense. His resting heart rate was 250.
Oh my gosh.
No. And it was, I can't imagine it. Well, 170, I feel like I'm going to pop. And he was, laying in the bed. They had put this mask on his face that just totally super pressure oxygen into your, forces it into your throat, your nose. And it was still up there. And they said, we're going to have to put him on a vent to give him a rest. And that's all I could think about was that doctor in Philadelphia that, the whole time I had this thing in my head. I'm like, I do not want to put him on a ventilator. That's going to be the end of it, right? So the next morning, they decided to do it. The brothers had just gone to this little school they were attending nearby, and I was like, can we bring those boys in to see him before we put him down? It sounds bad, put him down, but, put you under anesthesia. It won't sound like he's a dog or anything. Anyway, a friend went and picked him up. We brought him in, and they all gave him a hug, and he was, confused. He's like, why are y'all talking to me this way? And it was awful. I mean, you feel like you're getting ready to, give your kid this ID and he passes out and that's the last time you're going to see him. We had a priest come in, do last rites. And then, as soon as he, but his heart rate, he was just, he was having such a hard time breathing that it was just brutal to watch it. And as soon as he got peaceful and they were able to, put the vent in, and he was, taking the pressure off his lung, and he was resting. There was this, at that point in time, I thought that was it. I mean, honestly, I didn't think we were going to speak to him again. There was this odd sense of comfort. It was, and it lasted a while, and I felt like we've done what we could. We were good parents. He's a great kid. It was, he's not suffering anymore. And then the second time we had to vent him after the fourth transplant, it's the same thing. There's, it's just this space that floats around up there that, just where you realize, that, and it has to be between something, if you look at boundaries, pain is the part that we were out of then, right? And grace is what floats around between that and the ultimate peace, which is what I had assumed he had achieved at the time, but fortunately he's still here.
I mean, it's unbelievable, and nobody can empathize, I think, with you unless they've been through this. And so I wish I could say I even understand a shred of what that was, but I can imagine how horrible it was. And I'm grateful that he is still with us. I would love to talk a little bit about the legacy that he continues to lead through the Press On Fund and elsewhere. What are some of the positive things that have come out of this experience, both for your family and then for the broader pediatric, leukemia community?
Well, on the small side, the book. I mean, and just I get emails and people find my address or whatever who've read it for various reasons. Obviously kids, families with kids with cancer, but I've had a guy email me or write me a letter rather one time that saying that he had just gone through an awful divorce and he was lost and he was, just didn't know where things were going, and that book helped him with perspective. I've had people contact me because a loved one passed away or whatever reason, everybody's, whatever that peak of stress or, where you think it's the end, it can be defined in a lot of ways. I mean, it may be something, compared to what this maybe seemed to me, not as big of a deal, but to them it's a big deal, right? So,
yeah, right.
So that's good. But the big part, the Press On Fund was started originally, it was the Patrick R. Chance Fund, which is, I mentioned Stephen, our friend. Their son Patrick, as I mentioned, also had neuroblastoma, and Stephen just had the idea of starting this thing while the kids were still around, because Patrick passed away. And he knew that relapsed neuroblastoma is effectively a death certificate, and that there's very few survivors of pediatric relapsed pediatric neuroblastoma, or neuroblastoma, I should say. It's mostly a pediatric disease. I don't need to say that part. When we were getting ready to go through it again with AML, you realize that he just came to me and said, "Hey, listen, y'all are in the same basket. There's not many cures left for our kids, so why don't we raise money?" Like our card decks were low. We didn't have many cards left in them, so let's basically go out and raise money and get some new cards. If we can find some research
Yeah.
that may save one of our
Right.
kids' life, let's do it. So
Right.
that's really what started it. And we were able to get a little bit dumb. It's hard to raise money and run a foundation when your kid's fighting for his life, right? But as time went on, Patrick passed away, unfortunately, on his 10th birthday. When think of all these birthdays of this. And so obviously, the chances were, I wouldn't have blamed them if they just wanted to quit, put it all behind them, but they wanted to make certain that Patrick's life had meaning and left them a legacy. Of all the people we knew at St. Jude's from living in Target House, there were, right now, Brennan was the only one living. There were probably a dozen families we were close to. I would say 10 that we were really close to, and including us. And, he's the only one still around. So we expanded it from AML and neuroblastoma to really just pediatric cancer in general, because some of these had, and anyway, long story short is we put together a medical research team, and they're just out bird dogging things. I mean, even at the St. Jude with all, they raised a lot of money. It's a charity hospitals though, right? And they got one of the best researchers on the planet. But every year those researchers have to compete, for money, to say, we want to get,
Of course.
focus on mine to get this off the shelf and into the clinics to try to save some kids' lives. So these guys will say, hey, we heard about, for example, in the early days, there was a drug called plerixafor that was at Sloan. It was a relapsed neuroblastoma drug, and it was created, but it was sitting on the shelf because the drug companies wouldn't take it because there's a small patient population. There was no profit in it for the drug
Crazy.
companies, right? So why invest in something that's going to lose money, even though the kids are going to die, right? That makes sense.
It's crazy.
So from our money, we raised, we had $500,000. There was another thing called a Band of Parents, which is another grassroots pediatric cancer foundation group out in New York, mostly Sloan families. They raised another half, and then PepsiCo matched it, and we were able to get it off the shelf. So that's like a big victory at the beginning. And then that went through. We ended up giving money. We're agnostic as to the institution. We've done it at St. Jude's. We've done it at Medical University of South Carolina, Children's of Los Angeles, Children's of Atlanta, Children's of Philly. My wife has been instrumental with this group called PTAML, which is obviously AML related, but it's AML has been so woefully ignored by the research group, and they were able to just shame the Leukemia Lymphoma Society into supporting this.
Good.
Back when Brennan was sick, Leukemia Lymphoma Society would use kids' pictures to get people to donate, right? And they even asked if we would use Brennan's for their South Carolina chapter, and I told them no, because I knew that only 4% of what they were raising went to pediatrics, but they would, milk the heartstrings of people, but not do anything for kids. But they are now.
Yeah.
And this is some people have probably heard this T-cell, treatments, and with this actually was the base of that was in Philadelphia, the foundational research component, and that's making a difference. But of all the things, and I have to say this, I may be a little premature because of the status of the ability of this thing to hit the clinics, but there was a drug created here at Children's of Georgia that was for, it started out for a drug for DPIG, which is cancer of the, basically it's a brain tumor, but it's in the brain stem, and it's pretty much dead. I mean, there's no cure. These kids were coming in to here, and this drug is immunotherapy drug where there's no toxicity to it whatsoever. You take the pill, they radiate just briefly the tumor, creates some trauma, and it targets the immune system to go after it. And these kids came in, they couldn't even lift their heads up. They were in wheelchairs, wagons, made weeks to live, and they're back in school.
You're kidding me.
And now, again, this was more of at that point, this is a drug, a drug was intended more of a quality of life. but these, I know families we've met, and they thought their kid had maybe a month or two to live, and they got another 3-4 years out of them of quality life, right? So then they've ascended to send to the next trial phase to other brain cancers, relapse, and found it. I mean, the curative statistics on this are astronomical. And now it's being, matter of fact, one of the two researchers in charge of it told me, he says, this is going to be the biggest breakthrough in cancer treatment since the advent of chemotherapy. And so right now, and and of all places, it's here. So they're right now, the FDA has been fast tracking stuff. They were sending kids to Augusta, Georgia from St. Jude's and Sloan and everywhere else.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
And now, our Ronald McDonald House was overflowing, and now they've got, we did it with Atlanta. Children's of Atlanta was the first partner. Now it's at Dana-Farber, and Boston Children's, Harvard, Cincinnati Children's, and they're all participating in this program, and it's a big deal. So I mean, that just that, and those few things right there are just examples of the types of things that wouldn't have happened had we not found the need to, or just felt the need to do something about it, because you can't shake it. I mean, if you can't shake that experience, there's not a day goes through ever that I don't think about it.
Of course not. I mean, it must be core to your being. It is fundamentally becomes kind of who you are.
And that circles back to your first question.
You're exactly right. And since that day, it's been forever changed. And maybe in some ways changed for good, and in some ways changed to make it more challenging, but definitely changed. And I guess maybe I would love to close, Turner, with a couple quick questions. Maybe a fun one. I know that you co-wrote a song with Darius Rucker.
Actually, I co-wrote it with a friend of mine, Joe Stevenson, from here, but he contacted me while we were in Memphis. He knows I play guitar, and he's like, Brad Paisley had just come out with that song, one of these lives, I think.
Okay,
it's a great song, but it's very sad, and heart-wrenching. We said we need to write a positive song.
That's amazing.
And so we kind of went back and forth on GarageBand, and thought it was, then we had it recorded, thought it was pretty good, and we started pitching it, and Darius agreed to record it. But the deal was, it had to be, we wanted it to all the downloads, anybody that buys it on iTunes or Spotify, all the proceeds go to St. Jude's. So it was worth downloading for that reason. And he was very gracious to do it. It's interesting, Universal Records at the time wouldn't let him do it, even though he wanted to, because it was not for profit. They were like,
why? Because it was like a pro bono thing?
Well, it was it wasn't, they weren't going to make any money on it. And
unbelievable.
It was like, Jesus, guys, it's like, to me, it was like a public relations bonanza, but they couldn't see that. But anyway, we finally found somebody at Universal who let it happen, and which was good. We had to, call people, the new people that go up the food chain, and we found somebody who gave it the green light. But yeah, it's fun. And there's a video, I don't know if you've gone to YouTube and looked at that video, but I've seen it 100 times. It'll make you bawl.
Of course, I've seen it, and it did actually make me cry. I watched it twice.
Another thing that I didn't have anything to do with, but Brennan's in it, and it's worth watching because it's definitely fun, is this thing called Hey St. Jude. It's a promo video they did, the song Hey Jude, and the Beatles song. And they got all these different artists in it. And Brennan was in it with Robin Williams. We went out to San Francisco, and that was a cool thing about St. Jude, that because Brennan was such a success story, they wanted him to be part of all these promotional things, and we were happy to oblige. They did save his life. So
certainly, absolutely. And so to anybody listening, please go look up both that Hey St. Jude and also the Darius Rucker song titled Possibilities. Both wonderful things to go check out. And I guess my final question to you, Turner, would be this. If you could just pass on one message to families that are struggling in similar shoes to what you were in, what advice would you give? Could you give any? And if so, what would it be?
Just, look your kid in the eye and just love them. It depends on, that, I think that goes through regardless, when Brennan was, when he was diagnosed, when he was going through all that, we were doing, my wife's a lawyer, I'm doing well, and all this stuff. And, there's stuff you do, and, I want to be on this, local board of this and that, and, all the things you think young professionals are supposed to do and all this stuff. And when he was diagnosed, it made me realize, what's important, And there was a lot of stuff I was doing because I felt like that's what I was supposed to do, but I realized it wasn't necessarily true to me.
Yeah.
And therefore it prevented me. There was time I could have spent with my kids had I been honest about some of that stuff. And so the cancer kind of let me, peel off layers of the onion, so to speak. But I would say, that, there's, just to love somebody, you got to be, it's a lot easier when you're with them. And, but I would also say that, if the worst happens and you do have to deal with this, that, it's a one step at a time, don't, call me, call somebody, but it's, there's something that kicks into gear that it's hard to explain,
Yeah.
You're like, how'd you do it? You all must be special. Like, nah, we're not special. We just, it just, and my boss said, if you want to succeed at something, find something you need to do, just do it, whatever you got to do. And don't worry about the consequences. Don't worry about the expenses, or don't worry about whatever, because it'll bleed you. But, just, at the end of the day, that's not what's important. It's that kid and faith. That's a whole nother interview.
Well, that's amazing, man. And again, I can't thank you enough for jumping on. It's been an honor to be a conduit for this story and obviously for Brennan's story as well. So thanks again, Turner.
Oh, awesome. And your podcast is special. And I know you're going to, and then hopefully this one doesn't make people too sad or whatever. But
Absolutely not.
But I have a feeling that you're going places with this thing, and I'm honored to be on it. So thank you so much.